that on the state exchequer, like some central governments do. Writing off loans is a very, very beautiful way of doing things. So then there's a reference, I think, Minister made to 42% of revenues to be paid back as loans. So there are issues like that also. So unless we sort out these issues of financial management, the further question would be, I go back to my favorite point. When you point two fingers, there are three fingers pointing at ourselves. So the local bodies also have to answer those 2 or 3 points as to how are they building their resource base so that they can repay also, they can invest also. I think the entire discussion is focused on that. How do we take the local bodies in that direction? Till then, when the states have to manage their finances better, they will do things like this, what is to be released, retain part of it, considered as repayment of the loan. I think the center also does that. It's not that only the states do with the local body. The central government also does this if there is no repayment coming from the loans as from the states are concerned. So certain amount of capacity creation keeps happening, and I think in a way it's good. I would argue that there is no static arrangement as far as ministries are concerned. If you have people who are there for 25 years or 35 years, then that would be an entirely different scenario. People like Anand move from ministry to ministry, so he also brings in a certain perception of how things are to be looked at. So I think in the given circumstances, that's the proper way of doing things. There was a question about TCPO and things like that. I mean, if they have to attend only seminars, that's one way of looking at things. What seminars to attend, I think people like Neeraj will take a call as to what seminars to attend. So the basic point is the capacity building task force report refers to these points. And if someone wants to take it up, or you could take it up for another discussion as to what has been stated there, it's a clear-cut agenda. If I remember, 23 points at different levels which need to be acted upon, which also talks about institution strengthening. I mean, the IAPAs and ASCIs and ICRIERs and NIPFPs and all such institutions becoming resource centers for the local bodies, so that they are not directly dependent on the ministry to get an answer. Ministry will come in when there is funding and there is a certain mechanism of the fund flow between the center and the states. So I think it's also there, and I'm sure you would agree that with the participation of consultant specialists in the contributions they make, all that goes as inputs into the policy making process. So when whether the JNNUM was conceived or now when they are doing the smart cities and the 500 habitations program, there has been any amount of consultations which brings in inputs from a cross section of society, I would say, including consultations in the states. That goes into the policy or the scheme formulation, and that is what is placed before the people. In that, the mayors also get an opportunity to participate, how effectively they do it, and what contributions they make, and what gets reflected. That's an issue to be debated. So the concluding point I would like to make is there are certain statements made in the paper I have presented. I think, also taking into account what Professor Sivaramakrishnan has said, we have to try to be practical, and what Mr. Subhashi said about answers which are more feasible. I look at it from the point of view of what is feasible. We have the constitution amendment given. States are not acting on it. How do we move forward? We cannot ask for one more constitution amendment, which I think will be very difficult in today's scheme of things. There can't be a consensus on that. So remaining within the scheme of things, what is it that can be done, which would probably take us in the direction of making the local bodies a little bit more stronger, or taking them in the direction of self-governance, if that is possible and feasible. But that's a question which cannot be confined to a discussion among academicians within a hall, because that will be a national discussion. And when it's a national discussion, I think it is the chief ministers who represent the state viewpoint. So that's why I've given this proposition that if the central government is keen to take this agenda forward, there has to be a dialogue with the states, which means essentially with the chief ministers, and a sort of understanding has to emerge as to, in the given next 5, 10, 15 years or so, this is how we plan to implement the spirit of the amendment of the constitution. I think that would be one good step to take forward, and in that, what I refer to is the agenda for action, or within the framework law, what states and local bodies should be doing and could be doing. That becomes important, and that has to be concretized at some level. And if you have something like that, then participants like it probably can continue to discuss. This was what was agreed with the chief ministers and the central government in 2015. Where do we stand with regard to that? And one can contribute to the process of making it get implemented better. In that process, all these issues of devolution or capacity creation or what should be relevant at that level and what becomes relevant at the state level, how the states would look at that. I mean, I was mentioning to someone, for a state, urban governance is not the only subject. I mean, when a chief minister or the cabinet looks at it. So it's a question of trying to flag this point as to why cities are important. I didn't hear that viewpoint. It's a little difficult proposition when I sit among economists. Economists also say that, why do you talk about this GDP and contribution of cities to GDP? Forget all that. That's the wrong way of representing things. So I'm glad that point did not get raised today. All said and done, I think the contribution cities make to the GDP becomes relevant in the discussion, because in the absence of any other indicator, where do the cities stand? What are the standards of living? How happy the citizen is or not? We do not have happiness index and things like that. So in the absence of any such thing, I think we have to have some measure of where do cities stand, where do rural areas stand. I'm not asking for a delineation or discrimination between the two, but it makes sense because there is more concentration of activity and there is more contribution coming out from these areas. 4,041 plus the close to 4,000 census towns, which we did not take into account at all. Because of the constitutional position, because the center or the urban system cannot take note of the census towns as it is given now, unless there is a change which comes about and there is a transitional scheme which is possible, which again was highlighted when the 12th plan report was prepared. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly, since we're out of time. I do think that capacity needs to be built. There is capacity lacking. There is no issue on that. But I guess there are two questions that come up: is where is it lacking, and how it should be built up. So in that context, I think what the minister said in terms of hoping that the institutions or institutes around various levels of government, local institutes, so will be able to provide the relevant expertise. Therefore, in Delhi, I would hope that the institutes that are dealing with these problems will be able to provide the capacity that is, or the expertise, I should say. Because I fully agree with Mr. Ramachandran that the government should have experts outside, not inside. Right? So that I strongly believe. In fact, if we look at what was happening to India prior to the 70s, I think that was a big change that took place. Right? Prior to the 70s, there was more. You mentioned Bagicha Singh Minas. He was actually outside the government. He worked in a government institute, of course, but it is an autonomous institute. He was outside the government, was very much involved in policy making. He was not inside the government. So in that sense, I fully agree with Mr. Ramachandran that if the expertise is outside, then there are no political compulsions. So the type of advice or suggestion or recommendations you would get are less expected to be politically driven and more expertise or subject or discipline driven. So, in that sense, I do think it is important. One last point I want to make is that there is a lot of excitement at the 5%, including in the mind of Isha, that 5% GST revenue that will be given. Unfortunately, I don't think that will solve the problem, because it is indeed true that the ULBs do not have enough revenues. But I think the real problem is they do not have enough revenue raising power. So just giving them the revenue, I do not think will solve the problem. It will make matters easier for them, but after a few years we'll be back into the same issues because the accountability is not being demanded of them. When we give them free money, right, or when we make the money formula driven, then clearly the accountability issue is not being addressed. So I would much rather that they have greater political power, greater powers given to them to raise revenue and be responsible with it after that.
Thank you so much. And I'll just end with one last comment from my ex-colleague, which I'm very fond of saying. The earlier Joint Secretary Transport had to say about urban transport. Urban transport being such an important part of all our urban space. Urban transport in India is both a constitutional and an institutional orphan. Nowhere in the constitution any of these three lists urban transport is mentioned. And as far as institutional, Delhi itself has about 25 or 30 bodies looking at urban transport. So that is I'll leave you with this sobering thought, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you. X session, people are requested to come over.
In the back. I think we should get people to move in, otherwise it's getting too. Debulina, please come here, this chair. All of you, please come this side. While they move around, can I just take 2 minutes to go around the corner? If you don't mind, huh? I'll just come.
So let us go into this session. We have three very eminent people led by Dr. Ishar Alwalia for discussions on the urban governance. Of course, having heard the previous one, especially the articulation by the speakers, Professor Ramchandran and others, I do find that there is a lot of cross linkages between the three themes. So even though the first presentation was related to the administrative reformation and things of that kind, I do see that the governance was coming on and off because you just cannot separate out the two. And so also was the questions concerning the capacity, which looks to be the underlying the thing. If you don't have the capacity, all the rest is academic. That's very clear to us. So you need to really start. Where do you start from is a question. On one side, you are talking of finance. On the other side, you are talking of capacity building. Unless they do meet properly, the other two is really the strategy. How do you want to do that? So we are going to have in this particular session, really, how are we going to address the questions of governance? And governance, of course, there are several problems of the type that has been enunciated. But of course, the opening remark by the minister himself was very clear that he is scared when he looks at the urban governance today. So that's what he started with. So it's not far from the truth. But there are many good points that has happened over the years in the governance too. I myself had the privilege of chairing a committee with Dr. Sivaramakrishnan and many other illustrious people who have worked in this area regarding the Bangalore governance. And we really took a year, went through the whole thing in nitty-gritty detail about what are the kind of structures that we need in terms of governance, what are the kind of parasitals and all other kinds of service delivery systems that we need to have for a city like Bangalore. The whole challenge that was posed to us was from something like 250 square kilometer when you had to grow Bangalore to 800 square kilometers and finally to 8,000 square kilometer. How there can be a seamless expansion that is possible in an ordered and structured way? That is the question that was posed to us. I should say that the document has been there with the government for the last almost 7 or 8 years now. I'm just checking with Dr. Sivaramakrishnan as to what has happened to the Metropolitan Planning Committee, which is one of the major things that we recommended for the overall thing with respect to metropolitan, the Bangalore metropolitan area. And he said that they have now tried to pick up something from that and put it under the BDA, the Bangalore Development Authority. So you can see the complexity with which these things are taking shape. And so obviously it's not going to be an easy thing, and there is also the political element that comes into picture in all these. So the capacity, the finances, the political element, and of course the role of citizens themselves, they are all components of an overall system where they have to match seamlessly, which is a very complex problem. Even from scientific point of view, if you want to do a complexity analysis of this kind of a thing, I can see it can lead to some imponderable situations. So that's what we are going to discuss. But it's not all that bad, as you will see from Dr. Ishar Alwalia. She is a great optimist, and she has shown that optimism by actual